Hi, first graders. This is Mrs. Hanson, and I'm going to read you the story, The Royal Potwasher, by John F. Waters and illustrated by Jill McDonald. This story is special to me because the author, John F. Waters, is my dad, and he wrote this story when I was little. This fictional story takes place in England a long time ago. My dad's father was from England, so that is why he wanted to write a story with a setting in England. I hope you enjoy this story as much as I did when I was a child. As I read this story, I want you to compare the way Alexander prepared for the royal feast with how the other cooks prepared for the feast. How did Alexander do this differently than the other cooks? Also, why do you think the king was not angry with Alexander at the end of the story? Once there was a tall and gangly lad who was so thin and bony he had trouble doing anything right. His mother said it was because he was growing so fast. His name was Alexander. Each day Alexander walked by the palace gates on his way to school. He always stopped to watch the royal palace guards. Alexander wished with all his heart that he could be a guard in the king's palace. The guards were dressed in elegant uniforms. Each guard carried a brightly polished sword. Each wore a red starched tunic and a tall black hat with a long green feather that waved back and forth in the breeze. "I want to be a king's guard more than anything else in the world," said Alexander. At last came the day for Alexander to finish school. He was old enough to find work. He headed straight for the king's palace. At the palace, he went to speak to the sergeant of the guards. But the sergeant laughed when he saw tall, gangly, thin, and bony Alexander. "A guard for King Jeremy must be someone special," said the sergeant. "You seem quite ordinary. You belong in the king's kitchen." And that's where Alexander was sent. In the palace, there were many kitchens. In each kitchen, different kinds of food were prepared. There were many different pots to cook the foods. In the smallest kitchen, far off in the back, Alexander worked all day washing these pots. "One day I will be someone special," he would say to himself. But each day was the same. He washed, he scrubbed, he scraped, and he polished every single royal pot in the entire royal palace. One day, King Jeremy called all his subjects before him, including the cooks and the potwasher. "I have decided to have a royal feast," the king announced, "and everyone in the kingdom is invited." Now his announcement upset the people of the court. If everyone in the kingdom came, this would be the greatest feast ever held. "How will the royal kitchens feed them all?" asked the royal head chef. "This sounds like an impossible task," said one of the lesser cooks. But King Jeremy was a wise king. After he had announced the feast, he called all the cooks together. "Everyone in the kitchen will be in charge of a special dish for the feast." "Even Alexander?" the royal head chef asked. "Of course," said the king, and he handed the chef a list. On the list was each cook's name, even Alexander's. Beside each name was a special dish to prepare. All the cooks returned to the kitchens. The head chef was the first to read the list. He found that he was to prepare the main dish, the succulent roast pig. Then each cook read the list in turn. One was in charge of vegetables. Another must prepare breads and rolls. Another was to serve wines and other drinks. The pastry cook was to bake tarts and pies and decorate fancy cakes. Finally, Alexander was given the list. The other cooks already knew what Alexander was to cook, and they chuckled and winked at each other. "Do you suppose the king has asked him to roast the royal pig?" one cook asked. The others laughed. "No, no," said another. "Alexander's going to bake the royal cakes and tarts." Again, the cooks roared at their own jokes. Alexander tried not to listen, but when he read his name, he was very disappointed. He was to make a side dish of macaroni. Imagine a royal feast, and poor Alexander was to cook macaroni, and it was a side dish at that. Alexander could not help feeling sad. When the other cooks saw his long face, they laughed louder and longer than before. This made Alexander run off to hide in the back kitchen, which was beyond the pastry kitchen, which was beyond the middle kitchen, which was beyond the soup kitchen, which was beyond the vegetable kitchen, which was beyond the first royal kitchen, which was where the head chef was to cook his succulent roast pig. The next day, royal invitations were delivered to everyone in the kingdom. Since it was an invitation from the king to a royal feast, everyone was glad to come. Alexander went to the official counting room. He found out how many babies there were in the kingdom. He found out the number of boys, girls, mothers, fathers, cousins, uncles, aunts, nieces, and nephews. There certainly will be a lot of people to feed, thought Alexander. At the royal storeroom, Alexander put in his order for the macaroni. The storeroom keeper was greatly surprised. "Alexander," he said, "are you sure you want 50 sacks of macaroni?" "Yes," nodded Alexander. "There are lots of people, and they are all coming to the feast." The storeroom keeper loaded Alexander's cart with 50 sacks of macaroni. Indeed, the pile almost reached the ceiling. Alexander pushed his cart to the first royal kitchen, where the head chef was carefully roasting the succulent pig. There was a huge red apple in its mouth. "Alexander," shouted the royal chef, "what do you have in that cart?" "My macaroni," answered Alexander. "You have enough macaroni to feed a kingdom," exclaimed the head chef. "I know," smiled Alexander. He pushed his cart through the vegetable kitchen. There, one cook laughed so hard he slipped on a potato peel. In the soup kitchen, a cook almost fell into the soup kettle. They had never seen such a tall pile of macaroni before, but Alexander paid no attention to them. He pushed his cart until he reached the back kitchen. "This will be the biggest and tastiest dish of macaroni that anyone has ever eaten. In fact, it will be fit for a king." Alexander smiled when he said that. He began to prepare his macaroni. He cried as he peeled onions. He sneezed as he sprinkled pepper. He opened all the sacks of macaroni. Then he looked for a pot. Alexander could not find a pot large enough to hold all the macaroni. He went to the royal kitchen, where the other cooks were hard at work on the feast. As each cook prepared his dish, he was sure that his would be the best. It was known that when the king was particularly pleased with a dish, he would often reward the cook. "May I have a pot for my macaroni?" Alexander asked. The king's cooks all sniggered and laughed. "Oh," roared one of the pastry cooks, "Alexander has no pot." The other cooks in the kitchens thought it was very funny that there was no pot for the king's macaroni. They didn't help Alexander one bit. So Alexander went into the town to try to find a pot. He stopped a fat peddler who rode a donkey. The donkey was loaded with urns, kettles, pots, vases, pans, boilers, jugs, skillets, and tubs. "I need a pot to cook my macaroni," said Alexander. "Take your pick," said the peddler. Alexander looked at all the pots, but none were large enough. Sadly, he returned to his back kitchen. Everywhere the other cooks were busy cooking, but Alexander's macaroni lay on the table untouched. When the cooks saw that Alexander wasn't cooking, They said he would end up in the king's prison. "You'll have plenty of time to think in the dungeon," said the pastry cook. That night, when all the cooks and everyone in the palace and court and kingdom were in bed, one person was not sleeping. Alexander was awake. Alexander had an idea. He lit a candle and took his cart. He tiptoed around the palace to take what he needed. All night long he worked. When the sun began to peep into the windows of the tiny back kitchen, Alexander was still working. Clouds of steam and tasty-smelling aromas poured from under the door and through the window. Finally, the time of the feast was near. All the people in the kingdom arrived at the royal palace. There were more people than anyone had imagined. People were almost falling out of the windows and squeezing out of doors. The royal head chef served his succulent roast pig. It was delicious, but there was not enough to go around. The first cook ran out of stuffing. The vegetable cook did not cook enough vegetables, and the pastry cook's bread and rolls quickly disappeared. The king was disturbed. He called for Alexander to bring in his macaroni. The rear door of the great royal dining room opened, and Alexander entered pushing his cart. On the cart was the royal blue bathtub. "Goodness gracious!" shouted the king. "What is my bathtub doing here?" One of the courtiers walked over to the bathtub and peered inside. He almost dropped his spectacles. He went quickly to the king. "Your Majesty," whispered the courtier, "there is macaroni in your bathtub." The king seemed very angry. Poor Alexander pushed his cart until the steaming bathtub was under the king's nose. When the king saw his bathtub brimming with tomatoes, onions, and piles of macaroni, he had a change of heart. He smiled. "My dear Alexander, you may begin serving." The other cooks of the royal kitchens could not believe their eyes. Everyone in the kingdom lined up to receive a dish of Alexander's macaroni, and there was enough for all. In fact, many people, especially the king, kept coming back for more. When the feast was over, the king was given his royal blue bathtub, all freshly cleaned and polished, and Alexander was granted one wish. The king now has his bathroom guarded by royal guards day and night, and the royal guard in charge of bathtubs is Alexander.